All right, well, hello. Welcome to our third Mission Control webinar. This is an ongoing series to show you how you as a test sponsor can take control of the exam development process so you can create or scale up your certification program and build new high quality exams more quickly. So if you missed any of our earlier sessions on job task analyses or item writing and review, you can find those recordings on our website or just reach out and ask us and we'll get that to you. My name's Andrea Brown. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Certiverse, and I'm here today with our Chief Psychometrician, Dr. Alan Mead. And we'll be talking about an often overlooked and sometimes maybe intimidating step in the exam development process, beta testing. So just a little bit before we get going, this series is presented by Certiverse. If you're not yet familiar, we are an all-in-one, award-winning, end-to-end online exam development and delivery platform. So our technology is designed to make every step of creating a test more efficient, more inclusive, less costly, and easier on the environment to boot. We'd love to tell you more about how we do that. So just let us know after the webinar or visit certiverse.com to schedule time to talk to us. Our goal is to keep the presentation to about half an hour, so we've got a lot of ground to cover. We're going to ask that if you do have any questions, you can put those in the Q&A section. You can make that anonymous if you'd like to keep it private, or you can have the group see it. And then we will address those at the end of the session. We do hope that you have questions and we're happy to talk about things. So with that, let's get started. Alan, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
So welcome everybody. Happy Towel Day. I hope you're a fruit who really knows where your towel's at. And thank you for spending a little bit of your time today with us. My name is Alan Mead, and I'm the Chief Psychometrician for Certiverse. And when I was a faculty member, I became interested in applying methods that come from AI, like machine learning and natural language processing, to improving exams. Psychometricians like myself have been successful for over a century in using big data. You know, if you hear about big data will solve this problem or that problem, we've been using big data to solve problems in and make exams better for quite a long while. In fact, that's the topic of today's talk. But that only happens after you finish creating the exam and you're in an opportunity where you can use it. And so became interested in applying methodologies that would allow us to analyze the content of exams before we get to that step. But today we're going to talk about the equally exciting big data approach. So we're going to talk about what a beta exam is. You probably have some idea, but we're going to talk about that, why you should beta test, whether a beta exam is feasible for your program. Then we're going to talk about step-by-step how you create a beta exam. And then, you know, if you use this big data approach, the only value is if you use it to refine your item pool. And so we'll talk about what happens after a beta exam to make use of the beta. And finally, you know, I'll touch upon the consequences, or, you know, what to do if you can't do a beta. So that's our agenda. So what is a beta exam, and why would you want a beta test? Well, to begin with, the process of creating an exam, you know, starts with some way of finding out about the role or the job and creating a blueprint and writing your item pool. And your goal is to get to this point where you're delivering items. So beta testing happens here after you create the test and before you administer it, so that you are using the best possible set of items. And a beta exam is an exam form for pre-testing items. It should approximate the operational exam. The scores on this exam should lead to, you know, actual credentialing decisions, a real pass-fail decision, but with delayed reporting. So typically you need some amount of time after the beta test window closes to do the steps that we'll talk about to produce the credentialing decision and reporting. Usually like 1 to 4 weeks would be typical. Usually the reporting happens at a similar time to when the exam goes live, either right before or right after the exam goes live. So that's what a beta test is, and why would you do a beta exam? The main reason is that no one can look at an item and decide if it's good. The proof is in the pudding, and that is to say the utility of an item is demonstrated by using it to measure knowledge and then analyzing the results. And just like other, you know, big data approaches, beta testing is the fastest way to determine the quality of your pool. When I say that nobody can look at an item and decide if it's good, one of the things that we ask subject matter experts, SMEs, to do is to judge the difficulty of the items. And I'm going to focus on talking about judged difficulty, because difficulty is one of the easiest things for a SME to judge about an item. And the correlation between SME's judgments and the actual performance of the item in a beta test is usually on the order of 0.3. And this is what that sort of data would look like. This is simulated with a correlation of 0.35. But we have 10 items on our form, and we've asked the SMEs, who are the authors and the reviewers of the items, to judge the difficulty. So items 1 and 2, they judged to be quite easy. They got a 2 out of 10. And item 10, judged to be quite hard. It's a 9 out of 10. So looking at the judgments of the SMEs, we see we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 easy items, 1 medium item, and 2 hard items. If you were trying to create a relatively easy form, then you've hit your mark according to these judgments. If you wanted a balanced form, which would be common, then this form is probably too easy. And over here we have results that would come from a beta exam. We have the actual proportion correct, which is easy to translate into a percentage correct. 95% of people got in the beta sample got item 1 correct. So that item is in fact very easy, and the SMEs were accurate. Item 2, 85% of people got correct. Well, that's easy. It's not very easy, but this isn't far off. But when you look down this list, there's a lot of discrepancy. This item was seen as easy, and everybody got it right. This item was seen as easy, and fewer than 40% of people got it right. So this is what I mean when I say that SMEs have a very hard time looking at an item and judging if it's correct or not. We have 1, 2, 3 easy items, 1, 2, 3 medium items, and 4 hard items. So this form is actually reasonably well balanced. If you wanted an easy exam, then this is probably a little bit too hard. And if you wanted a balanced exam, it in fact is. And so that's the sense in which subject matter experts have trouble looking at the items and determining whether they're good. Again, I picked difficulty because it's one of the easiest things. This is simulated data, but it's simulated to represent the kind of things that we see in practice. And I want to emphasize that it's not that the SMEs aren't working hard or something like that. This is simply hard to do. And this is the easier task that we set to them. If you want to talk about the item quality, that's even harder. And this item, for example, item number 8, there's nothing remarkable. It looked like it was a medium difficulty item to the SMEs, but 6% of your sample got the item right. That's a big red flag. Almost certainly there's a problem with that item. It has 2 correct answers or no correct answer, or it's very, very confusing. So these are the sorts of things that you can determine with a beta exam. And this is the reason why a beta exam is a best practice. So one of the questions would be whether it's feasible for programming. There might be lots of dimensions of feasibility. There might be logistical challenges or legal challenges to, if you're in a regulatory framework. But the number one question that I get is if I'm going to have to scrounge up a sample to take the beta exam, how big a sample do you need? And this is like money. More is better, and I don't know that there's an amount that's enough. But unlike money, I can characterize directly the effect of the sample size on the standard error of the statistics we're calculating. So here's the curve for proportion correct, and there's a similar curve for all the statistics that we'll calculate. And all of them have this shape where tiny, tiny samples, like almost nobody, produce huge amounts of sampling error that decrease rapidly with even small samples, and that decline more and more and more. And this continues, it doesn't asymptote until it gets to 0 at a sample size of infinity, which is pretty big, more than you typically have. But you can see that even small samples dramatically reduce the uncertainty in the errors. So when people ask me how many people do they need, I tell them that like a couple hundred would be a good sample size for a lot of purposes. In terms of the standard error of the item statistics, even a modest sample of a couple dozen or 50 or 100 people is a lot better than having almost nobody. So so if you can get a sample of at least 20, 25, 30 people, then I would say that that this aspect of beta testing is definitely feasible for your organization. So how do you go about creating a beta exam? Well, you need to select items, just like any other exam form. You need to recruit the sample to take it. You need to administer the beta exam. And then crucially, you need to analyze the results and be able to refine the item pool in order to make use of the things that you learn in the beta. So creating the forms isn't fundamentally different from creating other forms. If you manually create them to meet a blueprint, then that's how you do it. If you use ATA, automated test assembly, then you'd use that. You do want to allow some extra items, because the main way that we can help you is by identifying items that aren't good, so you can avoid using them, or that you can correct the flaws in the items. And so you need extra items to allow you to cut the bad items. And most programs that I work with want to have two forms of the operational exam. They want to have a form that a person would initially take, and they want to have a second form for retesting purposes. And so if that's the case, then I would recommend a double length exam form, roughly twice the length of an operational form. And then you need to recruit SMEs. And the SMEs should ideally be a random sample of the target population. Realistically, we always have a sample of convenience. But they might be subject matter experts who participated in the JTA. They might be item writers. They might be students, if the students have knowledge of the domain that you're testing. They might be internal SMEs, or you might have a way of connecting with the population of SMEs who will be taking the exam and offering the beta test to them. And the beta test should be as close as possible to the operational test. So for example, it should be administered securely. All of the items that are on the beta test will be items that appear in the operational exam. So the security of that form is paramount. And I think it should be paid, that they should pay something for the beta test. Oftentimes there's a substantial discount. Sometimes it's 100% discount. But if you give away the beta test, you're going to have a fairly high no-show rate, like maybe 50% or something like that. And I think it should be scheduled if the operational exams would be scheduled. And the results should eventually, after a delay, lead to a real credentialing decision. Usually, if you have a doubling form, you can't afford to allow the double amount of time. You can't afford to double the administration time, and that might be beyond what's tolerable. But offering extra time is desirable. And I also always recommend that the items be randomly ordered for each candidate, so that if there is any fatigue effect or any effect for running out of time, that it randomly affects different items for different people, and that overall you get a good sample for all the items. And if your vendor allows it, I would strongly recommend that you enable comments. Here's a report from the Certiverse system showing how the comment report would look. So item 245 has 2 comments. This is from our QA environment, so the comments aren't very meaningful, but a typical comment would be something like, I find this question confusing, or I think I already answered this question, or there seem to be 2 correct answers. And these sorts of comments can be extremely helpful in understanding the results and in correcting issues that arise. It assumes, of course, that you have a subject matter expert who can review a report like this and affect changes to the items. So what happens after the beta exam? The value of doing a beta exam is to have opportunity afterward to use that information. So you're going to analyze the items and the comments in order to drop or revise bad items. You need to set a standard for passing the exam. You need to select some operational exam forms, and you need to equate the standard that you set earlier to each of those exam forms so that there's a cut score for each form. Then you need to rescore the beta candidates and launch the exam. So item analysis has at least 2 steps. And in the first step, you want to clean the data. You want to identify inattentive responders, people who had technical difficulties, people who weren't prepared or were taking the beta just to see what it was like and they weren't really trying. And you want to eliminate people who are unrepresentative of what the operational candidates would be. And then you want to compute item statistics. For example, the difficulty of the items. Generally, you want at least half the sample to be getting an item right. And if you have more than 90% of people answering it correctly, or a lot more than 90% of the sample answering it correctly, the item is too easy. Easy might not be as bad as hard, but you might have a concern if there's lots of easy items. And then there are other statistics. The item total correlation captures the pattern that people who do well on the whole exam should do well on each individual item. And if you find that that's not the case, if the item total correlation is 0 or negative, that indicates an item that's not contributing to the overall exam. And so that would be a candidate to avoid. So here's what an item analysis report looks like in the Certiverse system. You start up here to remove people who had incomplete data or answered too quickly or didn't do well enough that you can that you can assume that they were trying their best. And for every item, you have a row. So here's item 273, which is part of the patient counseling. This is from our QA environment, so it's a very small sample size. But in this column, you have the mean, which is easily converted into the percentage of people who got the item right. This is 57% of people getting item 273 correct. So that's a reasonably difficult item. And the corrected item total correlation is 0.76. That's a really remarkably good corrected item total correlation that captures the idea that people who did well on this exam also do well on this item. So that's a very good corrected total correlation. And looking over this list, all of these are reasonably good except these that are zero. The reason these are zero is that everyone got the item correct. So since the corrected item total correlation is a covariance of the item performance with the exam performance, and the item performance didn't vary, can't covary with the test performance. So maybe this item is too easy, and I probably would only use it if you really needed another item for this content. We usually classify the items as red, yellow, and green in a stoplight model. And these might be yellow items. You might also want to classify some of these items that are quite hard as yellow items. The rest of these items would be green items. If the item had substantially bad statistics, it might be a red item. And you ultimately want to avoid the red items and use as few of the yellow items as possible. So the next step is to select the operational forms where you're going to be using those colors to select the best items, or at least to avoid the worst items. You probably want to adhere to the content areas in the blueprint, and you want to avoid item enemies. And you might have other program-specific constraints that you need to meet in setting up those operational forms. Again, typically you want to create at least 2 forms. Sometimes, if it's easy to create operational forms, you might want to create multiple forms with overlap, so that maybe you have 4 forms. And if form A appears on Test King, then you have 3 other forms that have overlap with that form but aren't exactly the same and have unique items. So you want to select your operational forms. And then once you've selected your operational forms, you can use the beta test data to evaluate the test level statistics. What's the average score on the exam? You probably want it to be above 50% and probably below 85%, but that's specific to the program. You probably also, if you have multiple forms, want them to be not too different in their difficulty across the forms. You want to assess the reliability. If you have a long exam, 100 items, 150 items, it's probably going to be reliable unless you've included a lot of bad items. But if you have a short exam, this might be particularly important. And again, you probably don't want big differences across forms. And then evaluating the passing rate. Is the passing rate surprising or distressing? We'll talk some more about that. But I think especially you'd want to be concerned about having different passing rates across forms. And I skipped over how you determine who's passing. You would probably use some method. The most common is the modified Angoff study. And in the modified Angoff study, you have a group of subject matter experts evaluate every item on a form of the exam and evaluate the likelihood that a minimally qualified candidate would pass that item. And then you combine those judgments to create a passing score for that form. And then you use equating to equate that cut score onto each of the operational forms you created. And this process is important because your exam forms are unlikely to be exactly the same level of difficulty. Maybe you're successful in having them be approximately the same and it doesn't make any difference. That definitely happens, that we do the equating and we find out that the passing score on 2 different forms is exactly the same passing score. But maybe one form is a little bit harder, one form is a little bit easier, and using this procedure is a way to ensure that the people who take the harder form are not disadvantaged, the people who take the easier form are not advantaged. You don't want that level of unfairness. So this is a methodology for ensuring that it's fair, that the passing score is fair for all of the forms of your exam. And after you've created your operational forms and set the passing score, you need to rescore the beta candidates. This is a little clip of how it happens in our system. You select the candidate you want to score, you select the target operational forms that you've created, and you're going to, in a minute, you'll see click select and it will submit that for scoring. There's another screen where you can release those scores after examining them if you want to examine them. If your system doesn't have this, then probably your psychometricians will produce these scores and you'll upload them. But and usually these are, again, released similar to the time when the exam is available for general public use. an extremely important aspect operationally that the beta test helps you understand is what the operational passing rate is likely to be, and you probably have an idea about what would be a distressingly high or low passing rate. If your beta sample is a random sample of your population, and if it's large, then the rate of passing in your beta sample will reflect the operational passing rates. But very often, because we use samples of convenience, it becomes more important than the calculations, the evaluation of who was in that sample and how that affects the passing rate. So for example, if the people who participated in the beta didn't have the opportunity or the motivation to prepare, the materials weren't available, then it's likely the operational passing rate would be at least a bit higher. And if on the other hand, your beta sample attracted people who were enthusiasts, or maybe was composed mainly of people who were very knowledgeable, who had helped you create the exam, then it's likely that operational passing rates would be lower. So that's another very important part that has a significant subjective component to it. So what happens if you don't use a beta exam? So the sky doesn't fall, it's not the end of the world. But during beta exams, we typically find somewhere between 8% and 25%. So it's a wide range of items get classified as red. Those might be confusing. They might be of the wrong difficulty. And they are, and if you don't have a beta test to identify those red items, then you'll use them operationally. And so it could be up to a quarter of your items are of low quality. You might be unpleasantly surprised about the passing rate. You wouldn't have that opportunity to forecast that and to adjust if the forecast was inappropriate. And you'll have reduced reliability. That might be a modest reduction. If you have flawed items, it might be a more substantial reduction. And flawed items can also tarnish the reputation of your exam. If the item is miskeyed, then the candidate will take the item. They'll think they picked the correct answer, but your system will score it wrong, and they may not realize that unless they challenge the item. But if the item has two correct answers, or is confusing, or there's lots of other reasons, that would be apparent to the test takers. And if there's many items like that, it reduces their confidence in the exam. And it reduces the reliability. The other aspect of the reduction in reliability is how long your exam is. The longer exams are more reliable. So if you have 100 or 150 items, then a small reduction in reliability probably isn't the problem. But if you have 50 items or 40 items or 30 items, then the reduction in reliability might be a significant concern. So these are some of the reasons why a beta exam is a best practice in creating exams. And so that's what I have prepared to talk about, and I'm happy to entertain your questions.
Yeah, well, we did have a few things come in. One question was your thoughts on how to do a beta test for exams administered on demand, where one can't delay reporting on the test results.
So I've had clients who, for instance, in a regulatory environment, don't feel like legally they can delay responding. So what they end up doing is they end up taking an exam, creating, polishing it as much as possible, and then launching it. And they treat the first, 100 or 200 people as beta participants. They get, whatever they get, and it's their bad luck that they took the exam initially. There's a lot of, issues that are associated with that make that a little bit sticky, but maybe that's the only option is to, just launch into the operational administration and then to evaluate the sample afterward.
Fantastic. There was also a question if we have covered or will cover live remote proctoring at some point. That has not been a topic we have done yet, but as we are kind of moving through the exam development process with these webinars, so we're sort of right in the middle right now, and I'm sure that will be something coming up, but appreciate your interest in that. There was also a question on whether an organization picking the passing score based on what they think it should be is, how bad is that as a practice, quote unquote bad?
So yeah, a lot of exam programs say, oh, we don't have to use an ANGOF study. 70% passing is the passing score, or they might want a certain percentage of people to pass. Both of those are considered not a best practice. Psychometricians are not lawyers, but whenever this comes up, some psychometrician says, well, that could be antitrust. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know. That could be antitrust to set the percentage of people passing. I will tell you that in programs that have a 70% as the passing score, they have a lot of problems with if they do identify a bad item, they have to decide then what to do about that, because they typically don't have an infrastructure to change the passing score to something that's more reasonable. So they have to use that. Sometimes they have the ability to give everybody the credit on the item. That's not a perfect solution, but that's one solution they do. But you have problems where the forms end up not being appropriate, not having the same level of the standard, and people who take the easier form are advantaged, and people who take the harder form are disadvantaged. So the best practice is to set the passing score based on what experts tell you, and then you evaluate with the passing rate, make sure it's in the right ballpark, and not to set it either based on some arbitrary standard or based on. One other little trick that I didn't talk much about is that most exams are reported on a reporting scale. So for example, many people are familiar with the old SAT reporting scale where 500 was supposedly the average and 200 was a low score, really low score, and 800 was a really high score. It's not like they have 800 items on that exam. They convert the raw score onto that reporting scale. And so if you have that practice, then the passing score can always be 70 on the reporting scale, or 75. That's actually very common. But the raw score that leads to that could be very different. And if you have a 50 item exam, for example, the raw score that leads to that might be 36 or something like that, or 35, but it gets translated to a reporting scale that's easy for the test takers to understand, where the passing score is always 70 or 75. Any other questions?
And there was one thought as well, that if we, so moving past the beta stage, or the beta testing approach, how often should you be rechecking your exam form to make sure it's got the performing as you'd expect it to?
I think that you should recheck the exam forms after a certain number of people have completed the exam. So however long that takes. For some exam programs, they jump right into fairly high volumes, and for other exam programs, they trickle in. So maybe after a couple hundred people have taken the exam. And then I think you should also check based on calendar dates, maybe every 6 months or every 12 months. It depends what your resources are, and you're able to do it. In Certiverse, you could check your item analyses every day if you wanted, but oftentimes you have to go through some difficulty to get those statistics. But I'd be worried about particular forms becoming known to test takers, and for the exam characteristics to change over time because of that. And so I would check it every 6 calendar months or something like that.
Fantastic.
Other questions?
I'm not seeing anything else, and that puts us right about at time. But if anybody thinks of anything else that they would like to get more information about, you can email us.
I love talking about this.
Alan definitely loves talking about this. So you can email answers@certiverse.com, and we will direct that to the appropriate person to get you a response. And of course, you can follow us on all of our socials, and strongly encourage you to subscribe to us on YouTube, because we will have some exciting things coming up over there pretty soon as well. So thank you so much for your time. We will be in touch, and feel free to reach out whenever you'd like. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.